Teacher fired for feeding hungry student. Parents' reaction shakes private school's foundation. Hello. Welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. Imagine being punished for a simple act of kindness. What if, in trying to do the right thing, you end up facing the darkest side of an institution meant to protect and nurture children? This isn't just about a fired teacher. It's about a moment so small, yet so powerful, that it revealed secrets no one was supposed to know. When one woman's compassion is met with shocking consequences, a chain of events is set in motion that will challenge everything you think you know about justice, privilege, and power. But what happened next shook everyone to their core. This isn't just a story about rules being broken. It's about hearts being broken. And what you're about to see will leave you questioning where the real lines between right and wrong are drawn. The bell rang, signaling the start of another day at Westbrook Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in suburban Connecticut. As students filed into Mrs. Thompson's classroom, the stark contrast between wealth and want became painfully apparent. Amidst the sea of designer backpacks and carefree chatter about weekend getaways to the Hamptons, 12-year-old Marcus Johnson sat quietly in the back row. His threadbare second-hand uniform hung loosely on his thin frame, a silent testament to the sacrifices his parents made to give him this opportunity. As Mrs. Thompson, a kind-faced woman in her mid-50s, began her lesson on American history, her eyes couldn't help but drift to Marcus. She had noticed his growing isolation over the past few weeks, the way he seemed to shrink into himself as lunchtime approached. Today was no different. As the clock ticked closer to noon, Marcus's stomach let out an audible growl. He hunched lower in his seat, face flushing with embarrassment as a few of his classmates snickered. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart constrict. She had suspected for some time that Marcus wasn't getting enough to eat at home, but seeing him like this, hungry and ashamed, was almost more than she could bear. As the students began pulling out their lavish lunches, sushi rolls, organic salads, and gourmet sandwiches, Marcus hesitantly unzipped his backpack. Mrs. Thompson watched as he rifled through it, knowing full well he wouldn't find anything inside. In that moment, something inside her snapped. Without a second thought, she walked to her desk, pulled out the turkey sandwich she had packed for herself, and discreetly placed it on Marcus's desk as she passed by. The look on the boy's face was heart-wrenching. His eyes, wide with disbelief, filled with tears as he stared at the unexpected gift. He glanced up at Mrs. Thompson, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. As Marcus took his first eager bite, Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She knew she was breaking school policy by giving food to a student, but how could anyone stand by and watch a child go hungry? The peaceful moment was shattered by the sudden appearance of Ms. Hartley, the school's strict vice principal. She stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before her. Mrs. Thompson felt a chill run down her spine as Ms. Hartley's gaze locked onto Marcus and the half-eaten sandwich. Without a word, Ms. Hartley turned on her heel and marched out of the classroom. The tension in the air was palpable, and Mrs. Thompson's hands began to shake as she realized the magnitude of what had just transpired. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with a message. Her heart sank as she read the terse summons to the principal's office. With leaden feet, she made her way through the opulent hallways of Westbrook Academy. The school's motto, "Excellence through tradition," seemed to mock her from every polished plaque and trophy case she passed. As she approached the heavy oak door of Principal Blackwell's office, Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She knew in her heart that she had done the right thing, but would the school administration see it that way? With trembling fingers, she reached for the doorknob, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. As she stepped into the office, the stern faces of Principal Blackwell and Ms. Hartley greeted her, their disapproval evident. "Mrs. Thompson," Principal Blackwell began, his voice cold and formal, "I believe we need to discuss your actions today." As the door closed behind her, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that her entire world was about to change. She thought of Marcus, of his grateful eyes and trembling hands as he accepted her simple act of kindness. Whatever the consequences, she knew she would make the same choice again in a heartbeat. Little did Mrs. Thompson know, Her small act of compassion was about to set in motion a chain of events that would shake Westbrook Academy to its very foundation, exposing long-buried secrets and forcing an entire community to confront the true meaning of education and humanity. As the meeting began, tension hung thick in the air. Outside the office, rumors had already begun to spread among the students and staff. Marcus, unaware of the storm brewing around him, clutched his backpack tightly as he boarded the bus home, the memory of Mrs. Thompson's kindness a bright spot in his otherwise challenging day. The stage was set for a battle that would test loyalties, challenge deeply held beliefs, and ultimately reveal the true character of everyone involved. And it all started with a simple sandwich and a teacher who refused to look the other way. The tension in Principal Blackwell's office was suffocating as Mrs. Thompson sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room, with its dark wood paneling and imposing portraits of former headmasters, seemed to close in around her. "Mrs. Thompson," Principal Blackwell began, his voice cold and measured, "I hope you understand the gravity of your actions today." She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "Westbrook Academy has a reputation to uphold. We can't have teachers undermining our policies on a whim." Ms. Hartley, standing beside the principal's desk, nodded in agreement. "It sets a dangerous precedent," she added, her lips pursed in disapproval. Mrs. Thompson felt a surge of indignation. "With all due respect," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I saw a hungry child and I acted. How can that be wrong?" Principal Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "It's not about right or wrong, Mrs. Thompson. It's about maintaining standards. Our parents pay a premium for their children to attend Westbrook. They expect a certain environment." The implication behind his words hit Mrs. Thompson like a physical blow. This wasn't just about breaking a rule. There was something much darker at play. "Are you saying," she began slowly, hardly believing the words coming out of her mouth, "that feeding a hungry student somehow lowers our standards?" The silence that followed was deafening. Principal Blackwell and Ms. Hartley exchanged a look that sent a chill down Mrs. Thompson's spine. "I think we've heard enough," Principal Blackwell said finally, his tone clipped. "Mrs. Thompson, your services will no longer be required at Westbrook Academy. Please clear out your classroom by the end of the day." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mrs. Thompson sat there stunned as the reality of what just happened sank in. 20 years of dedicated teaching gone in an instant. As she stumbled out of the office, her vision blurred with unshed tears. She could hear the whispers of staff and students alike. News traveled fast in the small, insular world of Westbrook Academy. Making her way to her classroom felt like walking through a dream, or rather a nightmare. As she began to pack up her belongings, her hands shaking, a soft knock on the door made her look up. It was Marcus, his eyes wide with concern. "Mrs. Thompson," he said hesitantly, "is everything okay? I heard some kids saying." She forced a smile, not wanting to burden the young boy with the harsh reality of adult consequences. "Everything will be all right, Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just remember, kindness is always the right choice, no matter what anyone else says." As Marcus nodded and reluctantly left the room, Mrs. Thompson felt a shift within herself. The initial shock and despair began to give way to something else, a determination that this injustice couldn't go unanswered. Later that evening, as she sat in her modest apartment surrounded by boxes of classroom memories, Mrs. Thompson's phone rang. It was her old friend and fellow teacher, Sarah. "I just heard what happened," Sarah said, her voice a mix of outrage and sympathy. "It's not right, Kate. You have to fight this." Mrs. Thompson sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. "I don't know, Sarah. What can one person do against an entire system?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Maybe more than you think," Sarah replied cryptically. "Listen, there's something you should know about Westbrook, something that's been going on for years." As Sarah began to reveal long-buried secrets about the school's practices, Mrs. Thompson felt a fire ignite within her. This wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about exposing a culture of elitism and discrimination that had gone unchecked for far too long. The chapter ends with Mrs. Thompson, her face set with newfound resolve, opening her laptop and beginning to type. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The Johnson family's modest two-bedroom apartment in the less affluent part of town was a stark contrast to the palatial homes of most Westbrook Academy students. Inside, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, pushing his peas around his plate, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Marcus, honey, is everything okay?" his mother Sheila asked, her brow furrowed with concern. She exchanged a worried glance with her husband Derek. Marcus looked up, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "They fired Mrs. Thompson," he blurted out. "Because of me. Because she gave me food when I was hungry." The silence that followed was deafening. Sheila's hand flew to her mouth while Derek's grip on his fork tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Oh, baby," Sheila said, moving to embrace her son. "It's not your fault. Mrs. Thompson was just being kind." Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I knew this was a mistake," he muttered, pacing the small kitchen. "We never should have sent him to that school. We don't belong there." Sheila shot him a warning look over Marcus's head. They had worked so hard, sacrificed so much to give their son this opportunity. The scholarship had seemed like a miracle, a chance for Marcus to have the education they never had. But now the dark underbelly of Westbrook Academy was beginning to show itself. The next morning, as Sheila walked Marcus to the bus stop, she noticed the stares and whispers from other Westbrook parents. One mother, dripping in designer labels, approached her with a saccharine smile. "Sheila, dear," the woman said, her voice syrupy sweet. "We're having a little meeting this afternoon about recent events. We thought you might like to attend." Sheila felt her stomach drop. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. "I'll be there." As the day progressed, the tension mounted. Derek received several concerned calls from business associates whose children also attended Westbrook. The message was clear. Their continued presence at the school was becoming problematic. By the time Sheila arrived at the hastily arranged parent meeting, her nerves were frayed. The country club where they gathered was another reminder of the world they were trying to navigate. A world that seemed increasingly determined to shut them out. "We're simply concerned about maintaining the school's standards," one father was saying as Sheila slipped into the room. "It's nothing personal, you understand?" Sheila felt all eyes turn to her. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. "Perhaps," another mother suggested delicately, "it would be best for everyone if you considered other options for Marcus's education." Sheila felt a surge of anger and hurt. They were asking her to withdraw her son, to give up on the dreams they had for him. And for what? Because he dared to be hungry? Because a kind teacher had dared to help him? She opened her mouth to respond, to defend her family's right to be there, when her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Kate Thompson. We need to talk. There's more going on at Westbrook than you know." Sheila's mind raced. She looked up at the room full of expectant faces, waiting for her to acquiesce, to apologize for her family's very existence in their world. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We won't be leaving Westbrook. In fact, I think it's time we had a real conversation about what's really going on at this school." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. As Sheila stood her ground, she felt a mix of fear and determination. They had been silent for too long, trying to fit in, to not make waves, but no more. It was time to speak up, to fight back. And with Mrs. Thompson's mysterious message burning a hole in her pocket, Sheila knew this was just the beginning. As she left the meeting, head held high despite the hostile stares, Sheila couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something much bigger than they could have imagined. The secrets of Westbrook Academy were about to be exposed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of unease as Sheila Johnson hurried down the tree-lined streets of suburban Connecticut. Her meeting with Kate Thompson, scheduled in a small coffee shop far from the prying eyes of Westbrook Academy, weighed heavily on her mind. As she pushed open the door of the quaint cafe, the bell's cheerful jingle felt oddly out of place. In a corner booth, she spotted Kate, looking different without her usual teacher attire, more determined, almost fierce. "Mrs. Johnson," Kate greeted, gesturing for Sheila to sit. "Thank you for meeting me." Sheila slid into the booth, her heart racing. "Please call me Sheila." And thank you for reaching out. I feel like I'm drowning in all of this. Kate's eyes softened with empathy. I know, and I'm sorry for what you and Marcus are going through. But there's so much more going on at Westbrook than anyone realizes. For the next hour, Kate unfolded a tale that left Sheila reeling. Systemic discrimination against scholarship students, grade manipulation for wealthy donors' children, and a toxic culture of elitism that ran deep through the school's veins. But why? Sheila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why go to such lengths? Kate's expression hardened. Money, prestige, power. Westbrook isn't just a school, Sheila. It's a gateway to the upper echelons of society. And some people will do anything to keep that gate closed to those they deem unworthy. As they talked, neither noticed the man sitting a few tables away, his newspaper held just a little too high, his ears straining to catch every word. Across town, in the opulent Westbrook Academy boardroom, a heated discussion was taking place. This is getting out of hand, growled board member Richard Kensington, his fist pounding the polished mahogany table. First that bleeding heart teacher, and now these people are causing a stir. Headmaster Blackwell pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a migraine coming on. We need to contain this. The last thing we need is for the press to get wind of our... The door burst open, revealing a breathless assistant. Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a reporter here. Says his name is Michael Chen from the Hartford Courant. He's asking about discriminatory practices and grade manipulation. The room fell into stunned silence, then chaos erupted. Back at the coffee shop, Sheila and Kate were wrapping up their conversation when Sheila's phone buzzed. It was Derek, his voice tight with worry. Sheila, you need to come home now. There are people here, reporters. They're asking about Westbrook, about Marcus. As Sheila rushed home, her mind spinning, she couldn't help but feel that a dam had broken. The carefully constructed facade of Westbrook Academy was crumbling, and the truth was spilling out for all to see. At the Johnsons' apartment, they found Michael Chen, a sharp-eyed reporter waiting with Derek and Marcus. Mrs. Johnson, Chen said, his voice filled with barely contained excitement. I've been investigating Westbrook Academy for months, but your family's story, it's the key to blowing this whole thing wide open. As the Johnsons shared their experiences, Chen's notebook filled with damning details. The discrimination, the subtle and not-so-subtle pressures, the isolation Marcus felt every day. But why come forward now? Chen asked, his pen poised. Sheila and Derek exchanged a look, then glanced at Marcus, who sat straighter in his chair. Because it's the right thing to do, Marcus said, his young voice filled with a wisdom beyond his years. Mrs. Thompson taught me that kindness matters more than anything. And staying silent? That's not kind to all the other kids who might come after me. As Chen left, promising that the story would break the next day, the Johnsons sat in stunned silence. They knew their lives were about to change dramatically, but for the first time in weeks, they felt a glimmer of hope. Across town, as night fell, lights burned late in the offices of Westbrook Academy. Phones rang off the hook as board members and administrators scrambled to control the impending storm. But it was too late. The masks had fallen, and the true face of Westbrook Academy was about to be revealed to the world. The question now was, who would be left standing when the dust settled? As Sheila tucked Marcus into bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. A battle for equality, for justice, and for the soul of education itself. Mom, Marcus whispered as she turned to leave. Are we doing the right thing? Sheila paused, then smiled softly. Yes, honey. It's not easy, but it's right. And sometimes that's the most important thing of all. As she closed his door, Sheila steeled herself for what was to come. Tomorrow the world would know the truth about Westbrook Academy, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Kate Thompson's phone began to buzz incessantly. Groggily, she reached for it, her eyes widening as she scrolled through a barrage of notifications. The Hartford Courant's expose on Westbrook Academy had hit the stands, and it was spreading like wildfire across social media. As she quickly dressed and made her way to her modest kitchen, Kate's TV blared with breaking news. Michael Chen's face filled the screen, standing outside Westbrook Academy's imposing gates. In a shocking turn of events, Chen reported, multiple sources have come forward with allegations of systemic discrimination, grade manipulation, and unethical practices at the prestigious Westbrook Academy. At the center of this storm is the story of a teacher fired for feeding a hungry student. Kate's hand trembled as she poured her coffee. She had known this was coming, had even helped set it in motion, but the reality of it was overwhelming. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Sheila Johnson. "It's out. Are you okay?" Before she could reply, a sharp knock at her door made her jump. Heart racing, Kate approached cautiously. Through the peephole, she saw a face she recognized all too well, William Prescott III, one of Westbrook's wealthiest and most influential board members. "Mrs. Thompson," his smooth voice called out, "I think it's time we had a chat." With shaking hands, Kate opened the door. Prescott's usual polished demeanor seemed slightly frayed at the edges, his Armani suit just a touch rumpled. "May I come in?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. As he strode into her living room, Kate felt like a mouse cornered by a particularly well-dressed cat. "I'll cut to the chase, Mrs. Thompson," Prescott said, turning to face her. "This situation has gotten out of hand, but I think we can come to an arrangement that benefits everyone." Kate's brow furrowed. "What kind of arrangement?" Prescott's smile didn't reach his eyes as he pulled out a checkbook. "Let's say, a generous donation to the charity of your choice. In return, you issue a statement clarifying that your dismissal was a simple misunderstanding. No harm, no foul." Kate stared at him, shocked. "You're trying to bribe me?" "I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial resolution," Prescott replied smoothly. "After all, your reputation has been tarnished. This could help you rebuild." For a moment, Kate was tempted. The amount Prescott was casually scribbling on the check could change her life, secure her future. But then she thought of Marcus, of all the students who had been silently suffering under Westbrook's oppressive system. "Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I appreciate your offer, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline." Prescott's facade cracked slightly, a flash of anger crossing his face. "Mrs. Thompson, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. This isn't just about you or Westbrook. There are larger interests at stake." As he spoke, a realization dawned on Kate. This wasn't just about protecting Westbrook's reputation. There was something deeper, something that went beyond the school itself. "What do you mean, larger interests?" she pressed. Prescott's eyes darted around the room as if suddenly aware he might have said too much. "That's not your concern. Just know that there are powerful people invested in maintaining the status quo. People who won't take kindly to this disruption." A chill ran down Kate's spine. She had stumbled onto something much bigger than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about one school. It was about an entire system of power and privilege. "I'm sorry, Mr. Prescott," she said firmly, "but I can't be part of covering this up. The truth needs to come out." Prescott's face hardened. "Very well, Mrs. Thompson, but remember, you had your chance." With that, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with an ominous finality. Kate sank onto her couch, her mind reeling. She had just turned down a life-changing amount of money and potentially made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the state. But more than that, she now knew that the rabbit hole went much deeper than anyone had suspected. With trembling fingers, she picked up her phone and dialed Michael Chen's number. "Mr. Chen, it's Kate Thompson. There's something you need to know. This goes way beyond Westbrook Academy." As she began to share what she had learned, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that she had just set in motion events that would have far-reaching consequences. The first domino had fallen, and there was no telling where it would all end. Outside, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, a fitting backdrop to the storm that was about to engulf not just Westbrook Academy, but an entire system built on secrecy and privilege. The truth was coming out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Westbrook Academy auditorium buzzed with tension as parents, students, and faculty filed in for an emergency town hall meeting. The air was thick with whispers and accusatory glances. On one side sat the elite families, their designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair, a stark contrast to the more modestly dressed scholarship families on the other. At the front of the room, Headmaster Blackwell stood at the podium, his usual commanding presence diminished by the dark circles under his eyes and his slightly rumpled suit. Beside him, the board members sat in a row, their faces a mix of concern and barely concealed anger. As the last few people trickled in, Kate Thompson slipped through a side door, her heart pounding. She hadn't been invited, but she knew she had to be here. Sheila Johnson, spotting her, waved her over to an empty seat next to the Johnson family. Headmaster Blackwell cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice strained. "As you're all aware, some allegations have been made about our beloved institution. I want to assure you that we take these claims very seriously and are conducting a thorough internal investigation." A murmur of discontent rippled through the crowd. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "Internal investigation? That's rich. We need an independent audit." Blackwell's face tightened. "I understand your concerns, but I assure you Westbrook has nothing to hide." "Then why was Mrs. Thompson fired for helping a hungry student?" another voice challenged. All eyes turned to Marcus, who had stood up, his young face a mix of fear and determination. The room erupted into chaos. Parents began shouting over each other, accusations flying. Kate watched as Sheila placed a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Suddenly, William Prescott III stood up, his imposing figure commanding attention. "Enough!" he bellowed. The room fell silent. "This is ridiculous. Westbrook Academy has been a pillar of this community for generations. Are we really going to let it be torn apart by the actions of one misguided teacher and the complaints of a few scholarship cases?" The venom in his voice as he spat out the last words was palpable. Kate felt her blood boil. Before she knew what she was doing, she was on her feet. "Mr. Prescott," she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Is that what this is really about? Keeping Westbrook exclusive? Maintaining your power structure?" Prescott's eyes narrowed as he recognized her. "Mrs. Thompson, I don't believe you were invited to this meeting." "Maybe not," Kate replied, "but I have every right to be here. And so do the Johnsons and every other family you've tried to marginalize." She turned to address the crowd. "This isn't just about one incident, it's about a systematic problem at Westbrook. A problem that goes beyond these walls, that reaches into the highest levels of power in this state." The room was dead silent now, all eyes on Kate. She took a deep breath and continued. "Mr. Prescott tried to bribe me to keep quiet. But it's not just about protecting Westbrook's reputation. There's something bigger at stake here. Something they're desperate to keep hidden." Prescott's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "That's preposterous. She's lying." But Kate could see the doubt creeping into the faces of those around her. She pressed on. "I have evidence. Emails. Documents that show how deep this goes. How grades have been manipulated. How certain families have been given preferential treatment. How—" She was cut off by a commotion at the back of the room. Michael Chen had entered, flanked by two men in suits who were definitely not from the local police department. "FBI," one of them announced, flashing a badge. "We're here to speak with William Prescott III and Headmaster Blackwell." The room erupted once again, this time in shocked gasps and frantic whispers. Prescott's face had drained of all color, while Blackwell looked like he might faint. As the agents made their way to the front of the room, Kate caught Michael's eye. He gave her a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of the role she had played in bringing this moment about. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Prescott and Blackwell were led away. The meeting was hastily adjourned, and parents and students alike spilled out onto the school grounds, their worlds thoroughly shaken. Kate found herself surrounded by a mix of grateful scholarship parents and curious reporters, but her eyes sought out the Johnsons. Marcus was clinging to his parents, looking both terrified and oddly triumphant. Sheila caught Kate's gaze and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." Kate nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. The truth was finally coming to light. As the crowd began to disperse, Kate couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Westbrook Academy would never be the same, that much was certain. But the ripple effects of this day would likely be felt far beyond these ivy-covered walls. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Kate felt hope. Hope for a future where education truly was the great equalizer, where kindness and integrity mattered more than wealth and connections. As she walked away from the school, Kate knew that the hardest part of their journey was still to come. But she was ready for it. They all were. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Westbrook Academy found itself under intense scrutiny, with news vans camped outside its gates and FBI agents combing through years of records. The story had captured national attention, sparking debates about privilege, education, and the true cost of success in America. Kate Thompson had become an unexpected figurehead for the movement. Her face splashed across newspapers and TV screens. She handled the attention with grace, always redirecting the focus to the larger issues at hand. It was a crisp fall morning when Kate received a call from Michael Chen. "You need to be at the courthouse today," he said, his voice tense with excitement. "Trust me, you won't want to miss this." Hours later, Kate found herself seated in a packed courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. The Johnsons were there too, along with other Westbrook families and a sea of reporters. At the front, William Prescott III sat with his high-priced legal team, his once immaculate appearance now showing signs of strain. As the proceedings began, Kate leaned forward, straining to catch every word. The charges being read out were more extensive than anyone had imagined: racketeering, fraud, bribery, and more. But it was when the prosecutor stood up that the real bombshell dropped. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the state would like to call a surprise witness, Mr. Jonathan Prescott." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jonathan Prescott was William's son, a Westbrook alumnus now in his late 20s. As he made his way to the stand, William's face drained of color. Jonathan was sworn in, his hands visibly shaking. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've spent years trying to convince myself that what we did was justified," he said, "that maintaining Westbrook's prestige was worth the cost. But I can't lie anymore, not to myself and not to all the people we've hurt." What followed was a stunning confession. Jonathan detailed years of systematic corruption, not just at Westbrook, but extending to college admissions, job placements, and even political appointments. The Prescott family, along with a network of wealthy elites, had been pulling strings behind the scenes for generations. "We didn't just manipulate grades," Jonathan revealed, his voice cracking. "We shaped entire futures, decided who would succeed and who wouldn't, based on nothing more than their family name or bank account." As Jonathan spoke, Kate felt her world tilting on its axis. This was bigger than she could have ever imagined. She glanced at the Johnsons, seeing her own shock mirrored in their faces. But it was William Prescott's reaction that truly stunned the courtroom. As his son's testimony concluded, the elder Prescott suddenly stood up, tears streaming down his face. "I'd like to change my plea," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "Guilty to all charges." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits, eager to break the story. The judge frantically called for order. Amidst the pandemonium, Kate locked eyes with Sheila Johnson, both women realizing that this moment would change everything. As the court was adjourned for the day, Kate found herself surrounded by a mix of stunned Westbrook parents. Some were angry, feeling betrayed. Others seemed relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted. Marcus pushed his way through the crowd, his young face a mix of emotions. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "What happens now?" Kate knelt down to his level, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Now, Marcus, we rebuild. We make sure that Westbrook and schools everywhere become what they always should have been, places where every student, regardless of their background, has a fair shot at success." As they walked out of the courthouse, Kate was struck by the symbolism of the moment. The crisp autumn air felt like a new beginning, a chance to reshape not just one school, but an entire system. The road ahead would be challenging. There would be resistance, setbacks, and difficult conversations. But as Kate looked at the determined faces around her, the Johnsons, other Westbrook families, and even some of the wealthy parents who had been moved by the day's revelations, she felt a surge of hope. This was more than just about Westbrook now. It was about dismantling a system of privilege that had gone unchecked for far too long. and it had all started with one simple act of kindness: a teacher feeding a hungry student. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Kate knew that the real work was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for the challenge. They all did. 5 years had passed since the explosive revelations that shook Westbrook Academy to its core. The once pristine campus had undergone a transformation, both physical and ideological. Gone were the exclusionary policies and air of elitism. In their place stood a school committed to true educational equity. On a warm June afternoon, the Westbrook Auditorium buzzed with excitement. It was graduation day, and the room was packed with a diverse crowd of families, a stark contrast to the homogeneous gatherings of years past. Kate Thompson, now the school's Dean of Student Affairs, stood off to the side of the stage, her heart swelling with pride as she watched the graduates file in. Her eyes sought out familiar faces. Marcus Johnson, now a tall and confident young man, his parents beaming in the front row. As the ceremony began, the current headmaster, Dr. Amelia Chen, no relation to Michael, took the podium. Welcome everyone to Westbrook Academy's commencement ceremony. Before we begin, I'd like to invite this year's valedictorian to the stage, Marcus Johnson. A roar of applause filled the room as Marcus made his way to the microphone. Kate felt tears prick her eyes, remembering the shy, hungry boy from all those years ago. Marcus cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice strong and clear. Fellow graduates, honored guests, faculty, and family. 5 years ago, I stood in this very auditorium, a scared kid who felt like he didn't belong. Today, I stand before you as proof that change is possible, that education can truly be the great equalizer. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. But my story isn't just about personal triumph. It's about the power of community, of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. It's about the courage of people like Mrs. Thompson, who risked everything to feed a hungry student and ended up feeding a revolution. Kate felt a lump form in her throat as Marcus continued. The Westbrook of today is not the Westbrook of 5 years ago. We've become a model for schools across the nation, proving that excellence and equity can go hand in hand. But our work isn't done. As we leave these halls, we carry with us the responsibility to continue fighting for a just and equitable world. As Marcus's speech drew to a close, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Kate watched as Sheila and Derek Johnson embraced their son, their faces a mixture of joy and disbelief at how far they'd come. After the ceremony, as families mingled on the lawn, Kate found herself approached by a familiar face: Jonathan Prescott. After testifying against his father, he had dedicated himself to educational reform, working tirelessly to undo the damage of the old system. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, extending his hand, "I just wanted to thank you again for everything." Kate smiled, shaking his hand warmly. "We've all come a long way, Jonathan. Your courage that day in court was the catalyst for so much positive change." As they chatted, Kate noticed Michael Chen approaching, his press badge hanging around his neck. He'd won a Pulitzer for his coverage of the Westbrook scandal and its aftermath. "Quite a day," Michael remarked, gesturing to the diverse, joyful crowd around them. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Kate shook her head, a wistful smile on her face. "Never in my wildest dreams, but it just goes to show, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can spark the biggest changes." As the sun began to set on Westbrook Academy, casting a golden glow over the campus, Kate felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and often difficult, but the results were undeniable. A simple sandwich, offered to a hungry student, had set in motion a chain of events that transformed not just a school, but an entire community's understanding of education and equality. Marcus approached, diploma in hand, his face split by a wide grin. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "I got into Harvard. Full scholarship." Kate pulled him into a tight hug, her heart overflowing with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus. Of all of you," she added, looking around at the graduates and their families. As she watched Marcus rejoin his parents, Kate knew that this was just the beginning. The students leaving Westbrook today were entering the world not just with an excellent education, but with a deep understanding of justice, empathy, and the power of standing up for what's right. The story of Westbrook Academy, of a teacher's kindness, a family's courage, and a community's transformation, would be told for generations to come. It served as a powerful reminder that change is possible, that systems can be reformed, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is a simple one of human kindness. As the last of the families left the campus, Kate took a moment to look back at the school. The setting sun glinted off the windows, and for a moment she could almost see the ghosts of the past, the old Westbrook with its rigid hierarchy and exclusionary practices. But that image quickly faded, replaced by the vibrant, diverse community that now called Westbrook home. With a contented sigh, Kate turned and walked towards her car. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students to support, and new battles to fight in the ongoing struggle for educational equity. But tonight, she would rest, knowing that sometimes justice does prevail, and that even the smallest act of kindness can change the world.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.